Hi everyone. In this video, we'll learn to recognize movement phases, in particular those of manual gestures. So when speakers produce manual gestures, very often their hands begin from a relaxed or resting position, perhaps on their body or at their sides, or maybe resting on a table. And then they make an excursion upward, outward, leaving from the resting position, and then produce a series of movements which are effortful and convey some sort of expression or meaning. And then the hands might return back to a resting position. So these are called movement phases or gesture phases, and they're characteristic of manual gestures, signs in sign languages, and also instrumental manual actions. So we'll learn how to recognize these by looking at some examples in just a moment, but I first want to show you a couple of papers that you can use to learn more about gesture phases. In particular, there's a paper by Kita et al., which is open access and has very good information on the history of the concept as well as criteria used to identify the different phases. And of course, the concept dates back to early work by Adam Kendon in the 1970s. And in his 2004 book, he has a very good detailed discussion of gesture phases as well. So I'll put a link to both of these in the description below. So let's look at a concrete example. This is Donald Trump at a campaign stop where he pretends to work at a McDonald's. And in this clip, which I'll play in a moment, we can see he produces two manual gestures.
I want to thank you very much for the use of your beautiful store. It's essentially a store, and that's great. So you know about the Trump store down the block? That's nice. Are we going to be able to go there?
It's about 30 minutes down the road.
Oh, 30 minutes. That's not down. That's a long way.
So first, let's just look at the overall movements that he produces when he produces these gestures. So we can see that his hands begin at a resting position by his side. There's an excursion into what we call the gesture space, and he produces a meaningful or expressive movement of the hands. Then there's a return to a resting position. And then we see this pattern again for the next gesture. So his hands are in a resting position. There's a movement into the gesture space. There's the production of a meaningful, expressive manual gesture, and then return back to a resting position. So these different movements have different names. So beginning from a rest position, there's a preparation as the hands enter the gesture space and arrive at the position in which the stroke will be performed. So we're looking for them to move into location. There's the meaningful expressive movements, and then there's a returning to the rest position. So what we have in this case is called a preparation phase, a stroke phase, and a retraction phase. Now in the second one, we see again, starting from a resting position, there's a preparation as the gesture arrives to the position in which the stroke is performed. There's the meaningful expressive movement, which is the stroke. In this case, there's also a period of time where the stroke is being held. That's called a hold phase, and it's common for gestures to be held after a stroke, but they can also be held at other points in the gesture unit, so that holds can occur elsewhere. We then see a retraction as the hand moves back to a rest position. So those are the general phases, the movement phases that are most common in manual gesture. Let's look at one in particular and identify exactly where each phase ends and begins. So starting here, I'm looking at his hands to see what is the first frame at which the hand starts to move from the rest position. And already we see his right hand has started to move. So I am scrubbing back and forward in Elan, looking for the frame at which it first starts to move. And I see it moving at this frame. Now I'm going to scrub forward, looking for the end of the preparation phase. So this will be where the stroke begins, where the hands arrive at the position in which the stroke will be performed. So already there, his hands are moving inward, so we're already into the stroke phase. So we need to scrub backwards to find the frame before the stroke begins. So there, his hands are still moving into position. This frame, they are in position, but the stroke has not yet begun. So we will add an annotation there and call this the preparation phase. Now moving forward, we're annotating the stroke phase, and we're looking for where the stroke ends and the hands start to return back to a rest position. There, they're already returning back. So I would end it here, and we're going to annotate this as the stroke phase. And now from here, we're looking for the frame at which the hands return fully to a rest position. Okay. Now his hands swing a little bit, and if you're doing a quantitative study on the timing of gesture phases, you will need to have criteria of how to deal with these kinds of swings. I'm going to look at it in real time. Okay. I'm going to look at that again. So it's hard to say if the swinging is part of returning or is some other movement. For this demonstration, I'm going to say that when his hands are fully relaxed at his side around here, that I could end that, mark that as the retraction for the gesture that he produced. But again, if you're doing a quantitative study, you will need to have detailed criteria to identify these boundaries. But for many projects, identifying a retraction at this level of detail will be sufficient. So now we can look at each one of these phases. That's the preparation, stroke, retraction. Now, the reason that we're interested in these gesture phases is that this allows us to study the temporal coordination between manual gestures and other semiotic resources, such as his talk or other embodied movement. We won't look at that now, but this is one of the primary reasons why we're interested in identifying the gesture phases at this level of detail. So we can see, for example, that his stroke is very finely coordinated in time with a particular word. Essentially. So his gesture seems to be conveying a sense of approximation or something similar as he says essentially. It's essentially a store. It's a kind of qualification. All right, so we could also do a similar analysis of the different phases with the pointing gesture, but I will save that for another day. So that is a brief introduction to recognizing movement phases. I hope you find this useful.